Hi listeners, it's Alex here to say that North Untapped is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network, and with a quick favour to ask. If you enjoy this show and want to help us reach an even bigger audience, please give the show a 5-star rating and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Now I know you've probably heard this request from dozens of other shows countless times, but it really does help us to reach more people. Thank you. Now, on to the show. The Canadian government was called out last week for issuing statements that defended Israel's use of force to, quote, assure its own security following Israeli airstrikes on Gaza that killed dozens of Palestinians, including children. The unsigned statement, which came from the Foreign Policy Canada Twitter account rather than directly from a government minister, echoed similar talking points to those that had already been issued by American and British officials and did not condemn Israel's deadly attacks on residential areas. Israel's latest assault on Gaza, which ended after a ceasefire agreement came into effect last week, began with raids on apartment buildings, killing 10 people, including a 5-year-old child. Overall, Israel's weekend-long attack resulted in the deaths of at least 44 Palestinians, including 16 children, and more than 300 injured civilians. But the latest round of attacks didn't stop there. In the days following the ceasefire in Gaza, Israeli forces conducted a raid on the city of Nablus in the West Bank in an attack that killed a 16-year-old boy. To discuss these harrowing atrocities and the response of the Canadian government, I'm pleased to be joined by Michael Bueckert, Vice President of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Michael, we're very glad to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So many readers of our newsletter will be very familiar with you and your incisive comments and analysis on events in Palestine. Like, we've interviewed you several times now on some of these issues. But for the benefit of everyone else, could you tell us a bit about your organization and the work that it does?
Thanks. Yeah. So CJPME is a national organization based in Montreal, where I am, but it was founded about 20 years ago. And it is an organization that seeks to challenge the Canadian government's approach to foreign policy to promote justice and peace in the Middle East. And it does that through quite a number of ways. We have research and advocacy, developing fact sheets and position papers and things to help inform people in Canada about what's going on. And to inform decision makers as well. That's another aspect of what we do is lobbying and trying to directly challenge Canadian policy and to push, both the government but also members of the opposition to take better positions on these issues and keep them informed. But we're also very much a grassroots organization, and we are involved in campaigns. For example, early on, we adopted the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is a Palestinian-led call to adopt economic pressure against Israel until it supports international law. And so there's lots of different ways that we support BDS campaigns, consumer boycotts, and supporting students on campuses as well to do Palestine solidarity work. So a lot of our focus is on Palestine, but we also focus on issues like all sorts of things, but one of the major issues we have been following lately is, of course, Canada's arms deal with Saudi Arabia and the effect that has in the war on Yemen. And so that's the kind of a breadth of some of the things we work on, and you can check us out cjpme.org to find all of that stuff.
Why the Middle East? This is obviously such a central region in terms of global foreign policy, but why do you think the focus on this particular region is so important in terms of, fighting for human rights and just foreign policy?
Well, this organization started because the co-founders, one of them was Palestinian Canadian, and it was founded during the Second Intifada, watching the massacres in Jenin refugee camp and across the West Bank and Gaza, and the need to do something about it. And at first they started with a humanitarian project, but they realized very early on, of course, that wasn't going to solve this problem, that it was a political problem, and that, the Canadian government had a role to play. And I think the reason, that this issue gets so many people upset is because there's such a massive hypocrisy here from our Canadian government, where I'm sure there are similar hypocrisies when it comes to Canadian foreign policy around the world, but this is a particularly obvious one where Canada says that it upholds human rights, international law, while doing exactly the opposite, while aiding and abetting military occupation and apartheid, and criticizing and condemning anyone who criticizes or protests that regime of oppression. So I think there's something about that which is really galvanizing. It's the severity of the problem and the total inadequacy of the Canadian response. And so that's what we're trying to change.
I think that hypocrisy or that discrepancy that you talk about has really been highlighted lately with, these very forthright statements on war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine. Yes. When we see, these, I don't want to compare the two, but like there have been war crimes committed in Palestine by Israel for decades now. And it's very telling that Canada is willing to speak out on one, but not the other.
Yeah, we actually have done some research and advocacy around that. We have a position paper on our website that we've developed looking at how Canada responded to Russian crimes versus similar Israeli crimes. Obviously, the two contexts are not the same. There's many, many differences. But if we're looking at specific violations of international law, if we're talking about occupation, we're talking about annexation, if we're talking about the targeting of civilian populations, these are things that are very specific legal problems that Canada has taken completely different response to, whether it's in one case, putting sanctions on those involved in occupying territory versus providing trade benefits to people who are involved in occupying territory. So it's incredible to watch how quickly the Canadian society, not just the government, has sprung to adopt very far-reaching sanctions and other measures that for many years they've been telling us that these are not constructive options, that these are not helpful for peace, and then to instantly go ahead and adopt these things. I think it's been an eye-opening experience, but also creates a precedent that when people are calling for taking alcohol off of liquor store shelves, that's no longer something that has never been done. That's something people have seen done in response to violations. So there is some hope there that there is creating a precedent where these things are no longer intangible, but actually things that they've recently supported.
That's really interesting. Yeah, they're kind of creating a policy toolbox that could be applied to many other contexts. So I listed some of the examples of Israel's latest brutal attacks. Why did Israel launch these attacks over the past few days? And I guess, what's the difference between what is their narrative about why they did it and then what actually happened in terms of the causes behind this?
Well, in the, I would say, Israeli media, there's a lot of debate over why this happened and a lot of confusion. And a lot of people don't understand where this came from. That's an open question. The Israeli government's official line is that this was self-defense, that the Palestinian militant group, the Islamic Jihad, that they were about to attack Israelis and that Israel had to jump in. It was a preemptive self-defense action. So that's what they said. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. A few days earlier, the Israeli occupation forces had raided the city of Jenin in the West Bank and captured a senior commander in the Islamic Jihad. And during that raid, they actually killed a teenager as well. And then following that raid, the Israeli government was warning everyone about imminent threats, that Islamic Jihad was going to retaliate over the capture of their commander. So they actually put the region on lockdown. They made the borders of Gaza much more restrictive. They were not letting anything in or out. They weren't letting medical patients leave Gaza to seek treatment in Jerusalem and the West Bank, even if they had permits. They blocked off fuel so that it actually led to the shutdown of Gaza's main power plant. All of this in preparation, supposedly, for an attack. The attack never came. And when it never came, Israel decided then on Friday to launch this military operation targeting residential buildings and other civilian sites, leading to, I think, in the first attacks, there was something like 9 people dead, including a 5-year-old girl. And after that happened, of course, there was a response. There was retaliation by Islamic Jihad with these rockets into Israel, and then that's how this thing started. But the idea that this was self-defense is ludicrous. It was a preemptive, unprovoked military operation. If anything provoked it, it was Israel's own fears around its own actions in a raid in the West Bank. It's totally an aggressive war, and in any other context, we'd see it that way. So the idea of self-defense is absolutely absurd.
So often when we see international reports on these kinds of assaults, it's framed as quote unquote clashes or an exchange of fire without any noting of the context. But here, obviously, that's hard to apply when it's Israel that initiated the attack, and that the typical narrative that's applied really doesn't hold water in this context. I saw you tweeting earlier about the fact that there's really been very little coverage on this attack. Is that unusual for these kinds of assaults on Gaza, or would you say there's been more of a media, I don't want to say media blackout, but certainly a quieter media environment than normal on this?
Yeah, I mean, both the political response and the media response have both been totally not anything like it was a year ago in May, when there was, of course, I think the war lasted for 11 days rather than 3, and it was following severe, protests. And there are other things that were happening that people are aware of in Sheikh Jarrah with the evictions. Al-Aqsa was being raided, so there was sort of a build-up, and then an 11-day war. That also happened while Parliament was in session and near the end of a term, and not sort of in the middle of a summer over a weekend. So I think there are some maybe timing issues where it was a time when people aren't really working at full capacity, and they're not paying attention, and they're not and people didn't feel an obligation to respond because they're at their cottage and not in Parliament and actively meeting with constituents and that kind of thing. So I think it was quiet for that reason. The media, a similar thing going on, but the fact that as we'll talk about, the Canadian government's response was so muted. It means that, I haven't done a totally exhaustive media search, but as far as I can tell, there's been no media outlet to cover Canada's response to Israel's war except yours. So kudos to that. But that's incredible. That's unbelievable. The only reporting on this has been just copying wire from Associated Press and Reuters, which is good they do that, but there's a Canadian angle too. There's a Canadian government. There's groups like ours who have a position on this. There's Palestinian Canadians who are doing rallies. Those should also be represented in media, and it's not happening this time.
Before we get into the Canadian response in more detail, can you tell us a bit about what is it like for Palestinians living in Gaza on a day-to-day basis? Because even when these appalling raids aren't happening, the conditions are already pretty brutal on the ground, right?
Yeah, the context of this, of course, is a 15-year occupation by land, sea, and air of the Gaza Strip, which is locking in 2.3 million people in what is essentially an open-air prison. There are a lot of, I feel like the way it's usually talked about is through statistics, and that, so, for example, because of the deliberate consequence of these policies of blockade means that 56% of the population is below the poverty line. 46% are unemployed. 80% of the population is dependent on international assistance like food aid. You have 70% of the population are actually registered as refugees, because most of the people in Gaza, their families are not from there. They're actually from throughout historic Palestine, and they were forced from their homes in 1948 during the Nakba, around the creation of Israel. So these are people who fled their homes, found refuge in Gaza, and have never been allowed to go back to their homes, and now are trapped in a cage. And it's just unbelievably dire. A few years ago, the United Nations warned that by 2020, Gaza would be unlivable. people, they're resilient. The people are still alive, but it's not a tolerable situation. This is a human-made catastrophe, a human-made humanitarian crisis. And you know what? Canada doesn't even have a position on this that you can find. If you're looking for what does the Canadian government think of this, you can't find it. It's not on their website. They're not talking about it. But the United Nations considers this illegal because it's collective punishment of a civilian population. It's punishing an occupied population for things that they haven't done. So it's it's a catastrophe, and people should be more outraged by this, especially the Canadian government.
We've seen three major human rights reports come out in the past 2 years, concluding that Israel is maintaining a system of apartheid, which is systematically brutalizing and immiserating Palestinians, and the conditions in Gaza are obviously a key part of that. Have these reports changed the politics, the international politics around Israel's conduct, and have they shifted the needle in terms of popular demands for change? I mean, I realize these two might have different answers, but what are the dynamics around that?
Yeah, I think it's too early to evaluate. I think we're in the process of seeing a change. The analysis of apartheid has been around for many decades. Palestinians have been talking about it. Many people have, but it's only in the last, let's say, 10 years it's become quite popular, especially among Palestinians. And then in the last few years, in 2019, Al-Haq and a number of other Palestinian organizations prepared this legal brief to the UN talking about the crime of apartheid being committed. That was followed by Yesh Din, an Israeli group, and B'Tselem. And then last year there was Human Rights Watch, as you mentioned, and this year Amnesty International. And those two are really significant, not because they're saying something new, but because they are massive, mainstream, prominent, longstanding organizations that have significant ties and support in Canadian society, in international Western society, which have avoided this kind of language for a long time, but have decided through the internal processes that they could not continue to do these reports, to report on these everyday human rights abuses without identifying the root cause. And so have done something like, it's pretty incredible to see Amnesty International. Imagine all of it's not that little, like it's a fairly conservative organization in the sense that it's so mainstream, and yet it's been able to develop, to put something out like this, which it knows will be heavily criticized. So I do think that'll change something. Of course, there's a lot of people and institutions in Canada who are invested in the idea that Israel is a democracy, that Israel is, is basically okay, and that it's not committing apartheid, that whether they're invested in that ideologically or financially through different economic exchanges and other partnerships. So they're not going to change their mind overnight by things like this. But I do think that broadly, the fact that these organizations are going to be around and using this language for years, and that people who don't have a financial investment in the idea that Israel is not an apartheid state, for those people, I think it's just going to become more and more just a consensus. So I feel like we don't really know how it's going to shake up, but these institutions are so influential that it's hard not to see some slow change as a result of that.
It is interesting. I mean, yeah, like you say, we're still kind of feeling the after effects of these really huge reports. But just generally, it was kind of a notoriously controversial topic, even, say 5 years ago. But I do get the sense now, just in kind of like general life and in media, it is shifting slightly. Like I'm detecting different responses to when I write about this. I'm detecting different responses when I talk about it with people in public. Like, there does seem to be a developing recognition, but of course it will take longer for that to filter through at the policy-making level, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's been so many contributions to this over the years that it's sort of been building, but it used to be totally vilified to use the term apartheid, and some people will still try to vilify that, but that's a lot harder it's hard to make the case that the word apartheid is simply a slander that anti-Semites use when it's a very rigorous analysis that is coming from very popular human rights organizations. I think it becomes easier and easier for people to identify that as a disingenuous and false attack, and that there's actually something credible there.
So what has Canada's role been in kind of developing and maintaining this really untenable situation? Like, are there any major, landmark policy decisions that have helped worsen this crisis? And, what are some other things that this country does to sustain it?
I mean, there's so much, but I think when we're looking at sort of the ways that Canada is enabling occupation and apartheid, I would say that there are two main flanks of that that I draw attention to that are easy to understand. So one of them is that Canadian arms exports to Israel have been skyrocketing over the last 20 years, really starting with the Harper government, but then getting much worse actually under Trudeau. So this is a way that Canada is actually, we don't know that much because it's a bit of a black box. We don't know exactly what weapons are being exported, but we do know that Canada is exporting, for example, in the categories of parts related to military aircraft. And we know it's exporting components that are related to explosives and that kind of thing. And so there's a situation where Canada is injecting weapons into a context of apartheid, of occupation, of these repeated offensives. It's inconceivable that these exports aren't being used actively in who knows how many different ways. So this is one way that that Canada is very actively supplying the tools for occupation, the tools for violence. The other thing is that the free trade agreement that was signed in the late 1990s, sort of during a period of optimism, as maybe a sign of maybe Israel is taking this seriously, like moving towards peace. This will be a reward for moving in that direction, but it's really done the opposite. And through this free trade policy, what we've actually done is extend free trade privileges to settlements in illegally occupied territory. Canada doesn't actually consider this legitimately owned and controlled by Israel, and yet we're giving tax benefits, trade benefits, reducing tariffs, that kind of thing for people who are colonizing the land. And so in this way, we're actually kind of subsidizing the settlement process, normalizing it, and definitely removing any incentive to ending the occupation and dismantling settlements. And so I'd say between the arms and the trade, these are two ways that we are very much actively supporting the status quo. And the status quo is moving in the direction of increasing annexation. And so these are very serious problems with our policy that we're trying to address. But of course, there are so many different other ways that, Canada, for example, supporting Israel diplomatically on the international stage, no matter what it does. There are so many things we could talk about.
Right. And I guess in terms of the diplomatic aspects, in just the past few months, we've seen, we should emphasize that the number of crimes and atrocities that are committed on the ground are just colossal and far too numerous to comprehensively list here. But people can find a pretty comprehensive list in the Amnesty report and other reports. But we've seen two particularly brazen instances of Israel committing illegal acts of violence in recent months. So first, there was in May the killing of a globally respected Palestinian journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, to say nothing of the subsequent assault on her funeral procession. And then this latest round of brutal attacks on Gaza. How would you describe the Canadian government's response to these events? And were they at all surprising to you?
Well, with Shireen Abu Akleh, I guess, and this instance with Gaza, we know that Canada basically waited as long as it could before saying anything. Your reporting showed that, they were looking to other countries, the US, the UK, to evaluate their statements before basically copying that. And we can presume, given how long it took with this Gaza case, the response to this Gaza situation is that Canada put out two tweets. So it put out a tweet after full days of bombing, way late in the evening when no one was going to read it. It wasn't shared by any ministers or of anyone of importance. So really just kind of like set it out there to die. And it just said boilerplate language of, somewhat similar to UK, US, really meaningless. Then it put out another tweet, I think 29 hours after the ceasefire, welcoming the ceasefire. Again, late at night, and again, not shared by anyone, no one of importance. So nobody wanted this message out there, really trying to bury that response. So there's clearly, in these cases, an unwillingness to assert an independent position, and maybe even an unwillingness to speak about these issues at all, for whatever reason. With the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, I think there was more, again, it might have been timing because it wasn't over the summer. There could have been other reasons, but it wasn't something that they could ignore. Ministers had to speak about it. People were questioned about this in Parliament and in committees. And so you did have more of a robust sort of debate around this, where you had the government talking about the need for an investigation, but a lot of us, including even the NDP, other parties, were calling for an independent investigation and international investigation, one that's not just an internal Israeli investigation, which will lead nowhere because that never leads to accountability. The government never adopted that language, never agreed to support something like that, and never criticized really Israeli actions, which were clearly responsible for this murder, as was documented by a long list of human rights groups and investigations by international media. So in both cases, there's a clear grounds here to criticize Israel for this assassination, to call for actual accountability. Canada just will refuse to do that.
Yeah, the language they use is always, it seems so carefully stage managed. They're very deliberate about the words they use, so that to a passive observer, a member of the public, it might seem like a decent statement, like calling, I think the language was, oh, we need a thorough investigation. Well, who doesn't want a thorough investigation? But they avoid, of course, independent, specifically by the International Criminal Court. And then when those appeals come, Canada says that, it doesn't recognize Palestine as a nation, therefore it doesn't recognize its accession to the International Criminal Court. It's just this constant, I guess, like wrangling out of actually taking a concrete statement with concrete calls to action.
Yeah, and even actually an even worse example, if you don't mind, is the case of the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations who have been criminalized by Israel. It's been we're coming up to a year in August when the Israeli government designated them as terrorist groups, which puts their work in jeopardy, puts their lives in jeopardy of people who are on the ground documenting human rights abuses, and potentially will cut off their funding from international sources. People who don't want to be accused of supporting terrorism. This is like a catastrophic situation for very prominent, well-known organizations like Al-Haq, Defense for Children International, Palestine, Adamir, the prisoner support group, and some others. Canada said nothing for a very long time. When it was questioned about this in a committee, Melanie Joly just said I brought this up with Yair Lapid, the alternate prime minister, and I'm waiting for clarity on this. And that was all they said. And then there was like a petition that they had to respond to, and they said something like, they didn't criticize Israel's actions. They said something about, how great civil society is. And they said, we're not supporting any terrorist organizations. So really throwing these organizations under the bus, saying we're not going to say anything in their defense, but all we know is we're not supporting terrorism. So it was just like such it's so inadequate, and it's just so depressing because this is a very serious thing. Any other government criminalizing a country's most important human rights groups, would be roundly condemned. There would be serious action. Canada won't even comment on it. It's atrocious.
In kind of all these responses, it really does seem that, like, Canada was really looking to bury the issue in all cases, I guess, and to really avoid taking any position at all on it. In our conversation earlier this week, you talked about the fact that maybe there's an indication that there's conflict, there's tension inside the bureaucracy of the Canadian government. Some of them potentially have different positions, and so we get these really inadequate, pleases nobody type statements. What do you think of that? Like, I mean, I guess, like, as well, like, is there a sense that, the Global Affairs Canada would rather be focusing on other issues that it's more interested in prosecuting? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it could be. I think we need a lot more access to information requests to find out sort of what's going on. But I get the sense that there are different fractions within the government bureaucracy, maybe some who are far more sympathetic to some of the threats facing Palestinians compared to the Liberal government, which the leadership of the Liberal government is very hostile to Palestinian claims, is very supportive of Israel no matter what. But there's lots of members of caucus which don't feel the same way. There are many supporters of the Liberal Party who are actually very disappointed with how the government is handling this file. And so even within, just the party of the government, they must be having to manage two very hostile sort of fractions. And I think just in this mess of competing interests, I think we end up with these bland statements, and basically just saying nothing maybe is better than having something out there that like half of their base doesn't like. Like, it could be the sort of that's simple, but it could also just be cowardice if that's what it feels like. I don't know.
We've also, like, noted a few examples where Canada seems to have this habit of waiting to see what the senior partners, for want of a better phrase, in its international alliances say about Israel's actions before they make their own statements. And this is not the case with all issues, right? Like, I mean, we've seen, again, to use the comparison, and I use this comparison just because it's the concurrent big world events. And in terms of Russia, like, Canada doesn't wait to see what the US says to speak out on Russia's crimes or to sanction Russia, but it does seem to do that pretty consistently on Israel. So keep with that in mind then, like, can you see a world in which Canada does act independently to call out or sanction Israel, or will these bigger players need to act first?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a different approach because it's been so long that we've sort of been in this same mindset. Like, I think the Canadian government has always been basically a friend of Israel, far more than the Palestinians for sure. But the period starting, especially in the mid 2000s with Stephen Harper, is really when things escalated, and we've just never moved away from that. But there are examples from history, like within my lifetime, and I'm not that old, like in the late 1980s, during the first Intifada, we had the Canadian government stop all exports and imports of military technology to Israel because it was being used potentially against civilians, that it was involved in violations of human rights. And that lasted for several years, really, until the mid 1990s, when Canada reversed that, started to allow the exports of military goods along with the signing of the free trade agreement. So again, both of these things were sort of incentives, supposedly, to Israel for going ahead with the peace process, which it immediately abandoned when we kept these policies in place of arming Israel and free trade. But we've seen, this where for several years in the late 80s, early 90s, where Canada military exports were literally $0. And there's no reason to think we can't do that again. It's just, it's hard to see it today when, Canada won't even say anything as Israel is bombing Gaza. The minister won't even put out even a retweet of its own statement. So this is but yeah, there's models out there for action we can take if we want to.
Especially on the arms front as well. I really feel like, we're in a position now where the arms dealers have so much clout now, given everything that's happening in the world. It's really hard to see how, we would just drop to zero export. Well, sorry, I should say how this current government would drop to zero exports overnight. At a grassroots level, though, like, are you and your organization, we already talked about the kind of, broader change in the public opinion, but like, what are some of the shifts at a grassroots level that your organization is seeing in regards to Israel's conduct? And could this be enough to shift the needle, inside Parliament at a future date?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there's been like polling for years showing that there's far greater support for Palestinians among the Canadian public than is represented in the government, and that mismatch has been there for quite a while. I think we've seen, recently, like, more BDS resolutions and things like that. I think the biggest indication of this shift is the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty reports, where it wasn't just faculty associations in support. It wasn't just like Black Lives Matter or like activist groups, but actually sort of institutional groups that have a constituency among liberal supporters, right? That have a fairly mainstream audience. I think that tipping point is gonna have this difference. But I don't know, the gap between that, like, we've seen all this change for many years, like all of this movement at the civil society level, but that just hasn't been matched in any way at the political level. Except very, very recently, where we've seen last year the NDP come out in support of, it was members who voted for it, but since then the NDP has been articulating this support for an arms embargo and for a ban on trade with settlements, and that's really good. The NDP's position, really, in general, on this issue has transformed, in my opinion, over the last year, and has been much stronger than we've ever seen. It would have been inconceivable 5 years ago. Green Party is a mess, but they also, in like 6 years ago, their membership voted in support of BDS. That was, Elizabeth May threatened to resign, and they ended up coming up with a compromise policy to replace it, which nonetheless supported all of the different tactics and goals of BDS. So nonetheless, the party does on paper have some good positions. Occasionally they talk about them, but it really kind of depends on who the leader is. But nonetheless, those are shifts within at the grassroots level of these political parties that are real and significant, but it just hasn't made an impact on those who are actually in power, where something could actually be done. And I think my sort of take on this is that the more that this momentum grows at the more grassroots level, if there is no crack at the top, then we're just going to see more and more repression against Palestinian activism, because we're just going to see, like if people in power continue to maintain that strong support for Israel as there's more and more pressure, if there's no actual pressure on them to change, they're just going to continue to condemn BDS, for example, to take that kind of more of a hostile approach. And so I don't know what the next few years are going to look like, but things are changing very rapidly. There's lots of signs of, positive signs. I do feel like more and more people are calling the Canadian government out for these non-responses and sort of are articulating that. So we'll see. I don't know. We're trying. We're doing what we can.
Yeah, well, CJPME is really doing excellent and important work. Where can people follow your work and find out more about your advocacy?
Sure. So on Twitter, my personal Twitter is at MBUECKERT. CJPME is at CJPME. And actually, also, I'll plug that I co-edited a book that came out recently with Fernwood Publishing called Advocating for Palestine in Canada. There are a lot of contributions in there from both scholars and activists, people involved with CJPME, as well as independent Jewish voices and Palestinian Canadian perspectives, campus activists, and others. And it talks about some of these challenges and why it's so hard to talk and to advocate for Palestine in Canada, and where some of the change is coming from, including a forward from Libby Davies, who was a outspoken NDP MP for many years. So So if you're interested in these issues more, check that out. And get in touch over Twitter, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm really looking forward to reading that book. And thank you so much for joining us today, Michael. And best of luck with everything that's happening with your organization.
Thanks so much.